for people to sit around and discuss their favorite one-liners from a recent book they've read, from classic literature, a film. It seems that our ancestors were no different. Some 2,000 years ago, a interesting midrash records that there were 4 rabbis sitting around discussing what is the most important verse in all of Torah, the literature of all literatures. One rabbi maintained that the most important verse was a verse in Genesis that proclaims, "This is the chronicles of the creation of man. In the image of the Almighty did God create them." Another rabbi says, no, that's not the most important verse in the Torah. The most important verse in the Torah is our most sacred and solemn prayer. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hear O Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The prayer of Jewish faith. A third rabbi says, no, that's not the most important verse in the Torah. It is rather a verse in Leviticus that many of you are familiar with. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love your fellow as yourself, which was later recorded in rabbinic literature as being the most important mitzvah of the Torah. But then a fourth rabbi gets up and he says, no, the most important verse is a verse from this week's Torah portion in Parshat Pinchas in chapter 28, verse number 4. The verse in question reads, Et hakevet echad taseh baboker, ve'et hakeves hasheni taseh bein harboim. One lamb shall you offer to God in the morning, and one offering of lamb should you bring in the evening time. This is the mitzvah of the Karban Tamid, the communal offering that was offered in the time of the temple twice a day, which in its stead today, in the absence of the temple and all offerings, our sages instituted the daily prayers, the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer, Shachrit and Mincha, where we dedicate a few moments in solemn dedication and contemplation to the Almighty. What is even more strange is that the Midrash records that a rabbi rose and he says that the consensus and the halacha accords with the fourth rabbi who says the verse of this week's Torah portion is the most important, the verse discussing the daily communal offering. It is fascinating, number one, to see these rabbis discussing their favorite verse in the Torah and proclaiming which one is the most important in all of the Torah, when we know that every word of the Torah, every letter of the Torah, we are taught, is equally important. A Sefer Torah that where one letter, one verse is missing is invalid and makes no difference what the letter, what the verse is. And to declare that the verse that's most important, if we were going to choose one, is not the Shema, is not the verse that discusses the great dignity of mankind created in God's image, that God created us with free choice and created us in His image. It's not the verse of love your fellow as yourself, which Rabbi Akiva proclaimed, Zeh klal gadol b'Torah, is the most important principle of the Torah. But a verse that in this week's Torah portion seems relatively, compared to the other verses, not to contain the same emotion, the grandeur, and the secret that holds and binds Jews, Judaism, and the Torah together. What is the meaning behind this? One of the most fascinating interpretations of this cryptic midrash is from one of the great spiritual minds of post-medieval Jewry, the chief rabbi of Prague, Rabbi Judah Loewy, the Maharal of Prague, lived in the 1500s. And he writes that the secret behind this discussion is really what stands in contrast between Judaism and all faiths, all religions, and indeed, all types of literature. You see, all people, he writes, are inspired at some point, sometimes, in certain moments. All people can be moved to reach for higher purpose and goals. What is most difficult, though, is consistency. And therefore, the Torah teaches us, he says, that it's true that we were created in God's image. And that should inspire us to live up to our highest calling. And it is true that Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, is our most sacred prayer. It is our prayer that we teach our children the first thing when they can speak, we teach them that verse. It is also that holiest of prayers that we recite just before we give our souls back to the Almighty every evening and at the end of our lives. But those are moments, those are glimpses, fragments of time when we feel awesomely connected. It is also true that loving our fellow Jew is a most sacred mitzvah, the most important mitzvah of all of the Torah. But how many of us are engaged with any of these verses 24/7? We have up days, we have down days. We have days that we say the Shema with a lot of meditation and contemplative fervor, and there are days that we zip through the Shema and we're not paying attention sometimes to the words that we say. There are days where our love of our fellow is all-consuming, and there are days where that mitzvah is exceedingly difficult for us to connect to. And so the Maharal writes, the brilliance of this fourth rabbi, his name was Shimon ben Pazi, who says that the most important verse in all of the Torah is one lamb in the morning, one lamb in the afternoon. Consistency, to do something for God every single day. One of the complaints that Jews have always had about Judaism is if there were a little bit less mitzvot, if it was a little bit less demanding. Why does the Torah demand so much of us every single day, so often, every moment? This, Shimon ben Pazi writes, is the brilliance, is the majesty of the Torah. It is a commitment that requires consistency every single day, morning and evening. And surely there's going to be times when we don't feel emotionally engaged. Surely there are times when we don't feel inspired. But that does not mean that we don't have to do what we are meant to do. We don't do what's right just because we are not feeling up to the moment. And so while many people will say, I'll do it, but I want to wait until I'm inspired. The Yom Kippur moments of our lives when we stand at the end of Ne'ilah and we yell Shema Yisrael at the top of our lungs and blow the shofar is but once a year. The moments we feel connected to our godly image, the moments where we feel we love every single fellow of ourselves, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of work. It's not there 24/7, 365. But one thing we can do, he writes, every single morning and every single evening, we can dedicate several moments of our day to reflect on who we are, why we are here, and what is asked of us. To connect to God with one lamb in the morning, one lamb in the evening. In today's parlance, the relevance of this mitzvah today is the mitzvah of prayer. Of course, we are not always going to feel that we are ready for it every single day and that we can spend and concentrate and meditate. But that doesn't mean that we take a day off. Judaism and Torah and God never take a day off. This is the revolutionary idea of this verse of our Parsha. This was why the rabbis of the Talmud stood up and said and exclaimed that Shimon ben Pazi is correct. Of course, the other verses aspire to something greater, but they are not there every day. The communal offering, the daily offering, the prayer that we do every single day, morning and evening, consistency, training ourselves, even if we're not feeling up to it, even if we're not in the mood, but do something. 5 minutes a day in the morning, 5 minutes a day in the afternoon. Be consistent every single day is more important than waiting for that one big inspirational moment. We learn this in a million different ways, but nutritionists, exercise professionals will tell you a few moments every single day is better than 1 hour a week. The consistency of every single day pushing yourself to do a little bit, even if you can't do the full regimen, is healthier in the long term. So this is an important and profound lesson that the Maharal teaches us from our Parsha, is that what God asks of us is not always to be inspired. That's impossible. God asks us, we cannot always be in the level of the Shema, of the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, the Ne'ilah moments of our lives, the extreme and ultimate love moments of our lives. But what we can do is something every single day, consistently, affirming our Jewish connection, that Torah and the Jewish people are one every single day. Shabbat Shalom.